The enemy is present in Demidovka, hiding in houses. The fighting is ongoing, and work is in full swing. That is a Russian account of the ongoing fighting inside of Belgorod, Russia, where Ukrainian forces pushed in a couple days ago, and by most accounts, they're still very much there. So this is Ukrainian forces not just in Kursk, but now Belgorod as well, and we're going to talk about both of those, as well as a village in eastern Ukraine that Ukrainian forces liberated yesterday. But first, HIMARS strikes. Haven't had any of these in a while, but the Ukrainian GUR, or main intelligence director of the Ukrainian armed forces, put out this video earlier today saying that their special operations forces, in cooperation with the GUR missile forces and artillery, destroyed 2 enemy Ka-52 helicopters, so ground attack helicopters, and Mi-8s, transport helicopters in the Belgorod region. They say the helicopters were destroyed by missile attacks in the enemy rear at a jumping off point for aircraft. So think of this like in the United States, we have something called a FARP, or Forward Arming and Refueling Point, FARP. The idea there, because you're going to see in this video, it looks just like an open patch of ground, right? And the idea for a FARP is that it's hidden, of course, and well defended. Not as well defended as you might expect an airfield to be, but more than just a random patch of ground. But the idea for a FARP is that it is still behind the front lines, but it's closer than the airfield. So when the helicopter does eventually run out of fuel and or ammunition, they can go to the FARP, which has less of all of that stuff, but still some, and it shortens the turnaround time to get them back into the fight at the front. So it looks like in this case, the Ukrainian forces found that Russian FARP, if you will, washed it with some drones, carried out attacks. Now, Russian sources at this point are kind of mixed. I've seen one or two say that these were decoys. Could be. I've been fooled before. The decoy game by both sides right now is out of control. So entirely possible these were decoys. Most Russian channels, as of this report, are confirming that at least a couple helicopters were destroyed. Now, shifting over to the updates in Belgorod, I want to pull up a map here to give you an idea of the area we're going to be talking about. This is all of Ukraine. We've got Suryak map that I'll have linked in the description below. This red portion up here is the Kursk operation that we'll talk about here briefly. But just south of that, you'll see kind of the southern tip is this Belgorod operation that we're going to be looking at here. Demidovka is going to be a town you'll hear a couple times in today's video. And not as much from this area a little further south, but it's a small patch of ground, right? Small village, small patch of ground. In terms of the territorial change of control, it's not a lot. The reason that this is important is kind of twofold. One, Ukraine and Russia are today actively negotiating with the United States a ceasefire agreement. So every inch of territory that Ukraine holds inside of Russia is a bargaining chip for Ukraine. So it holds value in that sense. The other piece, and a couple of the Russian mill bloggers will hit on this in a second, is the idea that any incursion into Russian territory here forces the Russian forces used in Kursk to not be relocated to other areas of the front, but just to be pulled a little further south and continue to tie them up, essentially, inside of Russian territory. So shifting back over to a couple assessments here. Now, similar to a few days ago, all of these assessments, for the most part, are coming from Russian mill bloggers or pro-Russian accounts inside of Russia following the war, because we're just not getting very much from Ukraine at all. They've been pretty silent on this, maintaining operational security. So starting with military informant, they say it is reported that the Ukrainian armed forces were able to occupy the border town of Demidovka, but there is still no objective footage from this site. As was the case with the first days in the Kursk region, the enemy is diligently maintaining a regime of silence regarding the operation being carried out, which also limits the possibility for an objective assessment of the situation on the ground. So these guys are confused. They tend to have pretty good insights into the movements and conditions of the Russian military, but in this case, looking at Belgorod, they're all kind of guessing to a degree, basing off the limited reports that they have. They say the continuation of the offensive in this area, despite the initial losses, means that Ukraine has serious intentions of creating another point of tension on the Russian border to replace the almost completely lost bridgehead in the Kursk region, and that the enemy will continue to transfer new forces and resources. Now, I think it's worth talking real quick about the situation up in Kursk. So zooming out a little bit, this was an area that just a couple weeks ago, Ukraine held quite a bit more territory out here past Sudhza, and a lot of that has been recaptured by Russia in the last week to 10 days. In fact, earlier today, there were reports coming out on Russian channels that they may have captured or reached, I guess is a better way to put it, the Sudhza border crossing checkpoint right down here on the border between Russia and Ukraine. There's a couple Russian channels saying, be careful with that reporting. They're excited to put that out. right? And there's a couple saying, be careful with it. We're not entirely sure that's the case yet. But if nothing else, it looks like that border crossing is at the very least inside of direct fire range for some locations where Russian forces have advanced to. So the Kursk pocket is not entirely cleared out, but it's kind of been pushed out of all important areas. Now, Ukrainian forces are holed up in some of these tree lines, and Russia's talking about it, how hard they are to dislodge from some of these locations. But, a random tree line 800 meters into Russian territory is very different than holding, the town of Sudhza, if you will. So by most accounts, Ukraine has been pushed back pretty significantly in Kursk. However, they are still holding on just across the border area there. Now, shifting back over to some of the assessments here, a military informant talked about how there were actually a couple bridges destroyed in the Belgorod region, very similar to what we saw in Kursk back in August. He says there were bridges near the village of Grafovka, near Demidovka, and then another one 5 kilometers east that, and we have some footage here showing these, that were damaged at least, possibly destroyed. Of course, when looking at these bridges, it's not just a matter of can you and I walk across it on our own 2 feet, but what type of military equipment could it support? Heavy equipment, tracked vehicles, could anything like that move across it? And if not, then it's limiting what Russia is able to move into that pocket. And what we saw back in August in Kursk was Ukraine effectively sealed off a certain portion of the battlefield, making it to where Russia couldn't move heavy equipment, tanks, armored vehicles into that specific area. And it looks like they're trying to set that same condition here for a small portion in Belgorod. Shifting over to two majors, another Russian mill blogger here. He says in the Belgorod region yesterday, the main events unfolded near Demidovka, which, judging by reports from the field, changed hands. By nightfall, forces from both sides were present in the village and fighting was underway. Then turning over to War Gonzo, another Russian mill blogger here who's still alive. There were some rumors a year or two ago that he was eliminated in a trench line. That must have been a doppelganger because it looked exactly like him, but he's still out there doing his thing. War Gonzo reports, quote, the Ukrainians actually managed to break into Demidovka and engage in fighting. By yesterday evening, the enemy's presence in the village was known, but there was no talk of the Ukrainian armed forces having complete control over Demidovka. Russian forces are inflicting fire damage on the enemy's forces and assets. Heavy fighting is underway. Most likely, if the Ukrainian armed forces infantry manages to consolidate to new positions, fresh forces of the Ukrainian army will be brought into the battle in order to expand the bridgehead. And that's where we get into kind of the why. Again, the idea of pulling, or not the why, but the what comes next here. So the why is probably pulling Russian forces not necessarily away from Kursk, but that we're going to leave Kursk. Now they can't go to like Pokrovsk, Zaporozhye, somewhere else. They have to come down here and try to push Ukraine out of Russia again. But the next step here, Archangel Special Forces, again, a Russian account, gives an idea of what we might be able to expect. He said, quote, at the moment we are observing the presence of enemy groups. They have climbed in, got a foothold, and they are currently fighting. There are 200 or 300 of them now. That's a lot more than we heard initially. My impression in the first day or two of this fighting was maybe a couple dozen Ukrainian fighters, but we're talking now from the Russian accounts, 200 to 300. And keep in mind, on top of this, the Russian armed forces is saying that they've already destroyed or already killed 200 to 300 Ukrainians. So if we take all of their reports together, you're talking about, you're all of a sudden getting kind of close to 700, 800 Ukrainian forces possibly used in this engagement. But the 200 to 300 still actively fighting is the largest number I've seen so far. He says they're bringing in fresh troops on quad bikes and on foot, but not many. The idea here is simple, but let us remind you they're trying to pull our forces from the Kursk direction. Our artillerymen, in cooperation with the drone operators, are actively striking their positions and actively striking the logistics, and Ukraine is actively striking the logistics routes of Russian troops. And again, a major reason why here is there should be no expectation that Ukraine is going to push into Belgorod and then keep on pushing and pushing and pushing, just advancing this bridgehead. They're trying to hold a small chunk of territory. How small is probably up for debate, but anything inside of Russia does have some value at the negotiating table, and it looks like they found a soft spot and they pushed in, and Ukraine is probably going to hold on as long as they can. And I would say the same is probably true up in Kursk. It's just a forest belt, 500 meters inside of Russian territory. It's going to be hard to hold on to because Russia is going to be able to bring a lot of firepower down against a wood line compared to what even though they kind of went all out against their own villages. But nonetheless, having a foot set in Russian territory does benefit Ukraine a little bit in these negotiations. Of course, it's up for debate how much that actually helps compared with the losses that they inevitably will sustain during any major operation. Now, shifting over to the northeastern portion of Ukraine, if you will, I'm going to pull back up a map here So the 3rd Assault Brigade put out some footage yesterday saying that they had liberated Nadia. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Let's see if we can get this in the right spot on the map. So it's over here in the east, a little further north. I believe it's right up. There we go. How about that? Kind of zoomed right into it. I feel good about that. Finding the random small Ukrainian town, if you will. So this area here was recaptured by Ukrainian 3rd Assault Brigade yesterday. In fact, they put out some footage of this operation. I'll show what I can, but fair warning, the majority of it was pretty graphic, like a lot of just dead Russian soldiers lying all over the place. In that assessment from the 3rd Assault Brigade, they said the 3rd Army Corps has released footage of the first footage of a 30-hour operation that led to the liberation of Nadia. In total, Ukrainian forces have cleared 3 square kilometers of Russian occupation. The capture of Nadia cost Russian forces 2 months of effort and the destruction of 2 mechanized regiments. So a couple notes when looking at this area that the Ukrainians just cleared. Again, there's a couple takeaways at this point. The view should not be, look, Ukraine is on this massive counteroffensive to recapture all of their lost territory. It's minor advances where possible to take advantage, to inflict losses on the Russians, and to shift the lines in a favorable direction. So if we go back to the map here, you can see that it looks like, went too far in. It looks like they may have pushed Russia back to a river here. If this is updated, my understanding is they got right up to this river here, which means that it's a natural barrier. It's something, and maybe it forces Russia to stay on that side, build another layer of defense, if you will. So not entirely clear the strategic. Better said, I don't know that there's necessarily a strategic objective in this small little town, but it's a morale victory for sure for the Ukrainians to be able to say they're retaking some of their territory. And it does look like it shifts the lines at a critical point, moving it behind a water feature. But that's essentially what we have for today in terms of battlefield updates from the front. We've got a couple HIMARS strikes taking out Russian helicopters. Continued operations in Belgorod. Kursk is not looking good for Ukraine right now, but they are still holding on in that forest belt region. And then, of course, the 3rd Assault Brigade moving and advancing in Nadia. But that's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.